They told you to trust them, to kneel, to confess, to believe. But what if the very men you look to for salvation were trained not to guide your soul, but to capture your mind? What if behind the cross was a code? And what if the priests were never just priests? This is not just a story, it's a revelation. And if something in you has always felt off, stay with us, because what you're about to hear wasn't meant to be known. They wore robes, not uniforms, but they were trained like soldiers, not in the art of war, in the art of influence. They called themselves servants of Christ, but what they served was something far more subtle, something that moved behind pulpits and doctrines, beneath scripture, beneath symbols, a current, a code. The Society of Jesus, founded in 1540, was not just another order of the Catholic Church. It was a spiritual intelligence agency, a network, a quiet engine of control designed not to conquer land, but minds. While empires sent armies, the Jesuits sent missionaries. While governments built borders, they built schools. And while people looked to priests for salvation, these men were training generations how to think, how to see, how to believe. They mastered the alchemy of perception, not through brute force, but precision. Because when you influence the mind, you don't need chains. They understood something most still do not. That belief is more powerful than any sword. That memory, collective memory, is malleable. That if you control a child's education, you shape not only their thoughts, but their descendants. Over 200 universities, dozens of secret lodges, access to kings, to cardinals, to courts. They were not just preaching the gospel, they were writing the script of Western thought, scene by scene. And no one suspected a thing. To the outside world, they were humble, educated, holy. But behind the curtain, they practiced spiritual warfare. They studied psychology centuries before Freud. They embedded themselves in politics long before spin doctors existed. They advised empires, and when they were banned by monarchs, by popes, they didn't disappear. They evolved. What you believe about morality, about God, about history, about power, chances are they helped write it, because they weren't just priests. They were programmers of the collective mind. And their influence didn't fade with time. It deepened, it digitized, it moved from the pulpit to the algorithm. So if you've ever asked yourself why the world feels scripted, why some truths feel unreachable, why history loops like a broken spell, you're not imagining it. You're just starting to wake up. And once you do, the symbols don't hide anymore. The scripts don't hypnotize. The voice inside gets louder, because once you know who built the maze, you begin to find your way out. It didn't start with prayer, it started with war. In the 16th century, the Catholic Church was bleeding. The Protestant Reformation had cracked the empire of belief wide open. Luther's words were spreading like wildfire, and Rome, once untouchable, was losing control of the narrative. They needed more than sermons. They needed a weapon, not forged from iron, but from silence, precision, and obedience. Enter Ignatius of Loyola, a wounded Spanish soldier who claimed to have mystical visions, but whose mind worked like a general's. In 1540, he proposed something radical, an elite order within the church, sworn to the Pope with absolute loyalty, men who would go anywhere, say anything, do anything, to reclaim the world for Rome. But this wasn't just about saving souls. It was about psychological warfare. The Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, were trained not just in theology, but in linguistics, rhetoric, diplomacy, and human behavior. They weren't taught how to preach. They were taught how to infiltrate. Jesuit recruits were required to undergo years of mental discipline, not just memorization, but reshaping. They were molded to obey without hesitation, to adapt like chameleons, to enter foreign lands and foreign minds with subtlety. And their oath reflected this. It spoke not only of loyalty, but of manipulation, of learning the ways of a target nation, speaking its tongue, adopting its customs, and slowly converting it from within. This wasn't religion, it was strategy. The Jesuits quickly became the church's most effective tool. While cardinals argued and kings waged wars, Jesuits entered courts as advisors, schools as professors, and hearts as confessors. They understood that the battlefield had shifted, that in order to win the world, you had to win the mind. They wrote the textbooks. They restructured education systems. They trained the future leaders of Europe and the colonies. And all the while, their methods refined. Spiritual guilt, fear of damnation, symbolic conditioning, sacramental dependence. Not to inspire freedom, but obedience. Because if you can instill the belief that salvation only comes through you, then you don't need chains, you don't need armies. You have the keys to the kingdom of thought. The Vatican knew exactly what it was commissioning. The Jesuits weren't its holy men. They were its architects of consensus, its enforcers of a singular truth. And while other orders faded into ritual, the Jesuits evolved. They adapted to revolutions, empires, and even exile. And wherever they went, they carried one mission, not to serve faith, but to shape it. Now ask yourself, if their original mission was never spiritual, but psychological, how much of what you believe today was written by them? And more importantly, how much of it still holds power over you? Freixedo was not a man of disbelief. He didn't abandon God. He rejected the systems that distorted the divine because he believed in something higher, something real, a presence beyond names that doesn't demand worship, only remembrance. Obedience was never an accident. It was engineered. And the Jesuits didn't just demand it. They studied it, refined it, perfected it. From the earliest days of their training, recruits were broken down, not with violence, but with repetition. You wake before dawn. You pray, you confess, you fast. You memorize every gesture, every thought, every doubt accounted for, until your internal voice no longer belongs to you. This wasn't just religious devotion. It was behavioral conditioning. Modern psychologists would later call it operant reinforcement. Pavlov would ring his bell. Skinner would offer a pellet. But the Jesuits, they used guilt, sin, shame, the invisible leash that wraps around the soul, not the body. You were told you were broken from birth, that only the church could make you whole, and that obedience wasn't just virtue, it was survival. But obedience requires one more ingredient: repetition, rituals, chants, recitations, over and over again, until the conscious mind gives up and the subconscious submits, because repetition is the architect of belief. And once something is repeated enough times, the brain accepts it, not because it's true, but because it's familiar. That's how doctrine becomes dogma, how guilt becomes identity, and how control becomes invisible. Jesuit schools didn't just teach facts, they taught rhythm, cadence, a structure that looped the mind back into itself, until doubt became impossible. and for those who question too much. Confession, a ritual designed to purge not only sin, but resistance. You speak, you cry. You confess your secrets, your fears, your thoughts, your shame. But what you're really doing is training yourself to obey surveillance. You're offering your inner life to an external authority again and again and again until your own conscience becomes a prison guard. The science was simple. Condition the mind through guilt. Reinforce it through repetition. Control it through confession. And the result? A perfectly obedient subject who believes their obedience is holy. Today, we think we've moved past this, but the same architecture still rules us. We scroll, we click, we compare, we confess, not in booths, but in status updates. We're still performing the ritual, still running the program, because the science of obedience never died. It just changed robes. And unless we recognize the mechanics behind our thoughts, we'll keep calling the chains divine. So ask yourself, was it ever really about salvation? Or were you taught to love your cage? They didn't build temples, they built schools. And not just any schools. Foundations of empire, halls of prestige, institutions that would define not only what people know, but how they learn to know. From Georgetown to Fordham, from Loyola to Boston College, from Sao Paulo to Manila, over 200 universities across the world, each stamped with the same insignia, IHS, the seal of the Society of Jesus. But this wasn't charity, and it wasn't just faith. It was strategy, because if you want to control a generation, you don't start with the adults, you start with the children. You don't argue with their parents, you educate their sons. Jesuit institutions became the intellectual elite. They taught politicians, presidents, bankers, and philosophers. They were the architects behind the architects. Not always seen, but always felt. The curriculum was rigorous. Languages, mathematics, theology, logic. But beneath the surface, a pattern. Subtle reinforcement of a world view. A metaphysics that placed hierarchy over inquiry, obedience over intuition, doctrine over direct knowing, and most of all, reverence for the institution. Because once you believe the institution is sacred, you'll defend its message without question, even if the message mutates, even if it contradicts itself, even if it enslaves you. Jesuit schools didn't just teach subjects. They shaped perception. They embedded a worldview where the church is the intermediary, where the soul must be guided, where authority is divine. But what happens when the same pattern repeats across nations, across centuries, across languages? It becomes invisible. It becomes the standard. Modern secular universities still mirror the same structure. Standardized curricula, compartmentalized knowledge, obedience to the test, fear of failure. The robes have changed. The buildings are bigger, but the blueprint remains. And what's more haunting, most of the people teaching inside these systems don't even know where it came from. They don't know that the same man who wrote the spiritual exercises also designed exercises of the mind. They don't know that Ignatius of Loyola once said, "To believe that what I see, white is black, if the church so defines it." They just pass on what they were taught. And so the spell continues, not through malice, but through memory. Because the most effective mind control is generational. The student becomes the teacher. The pupil becomes the priest. And no one remembers the origin. But the seal is still there, etched on the stone, pressed into the diploma, echoing through the institution. So before you celebrate the university, ask who built it. Ask why. and ask what you were never taught to question. Education was never neutral. It just dressed itself that way. Behind every textbook, behind every syllabus, behind every framed degree on the wall, there's a story someone wanted you to believe. And more importantly, 1,000 stories they didn't. The Jesuits understood this early. They didn't just found schools. They sculpted the very content that would fill them, line by line, chapter by chapter, not with overt doctrine, but with subtle distortion, a shift in language, a tilt in historical emphasis, an omission here, a reframe there, because perception isn't only shaped by what you learn, it's shaped by what you're never allowed to see. In Jesuit institutions, theology wasn't just a subject, it was the foundation, and everything else, philosophy, science, literature, was stacked on top of it. God was at the top. But it wasn't the God of personal revelation. It was the God of Rome, the God who speaks through priests, through councils, through institutions. And once you believe that divine truth is only accessed through official authority, you stop trusting your own insight. That's the first fracture. But it didn't stop there. History, too, was rewritten. Kings became defenders of the faith. Rebels became heretics. Mystics who saw beyond the veil, silenced. Rebranded as madmen, pagans, or threats to order. And science, allowed to evolve, but only within a box. The heliocentric model, eventually embraced. But theories that challenged materialism, suppressed. Energy fields, consciousness studies, ancient knowledge systems, discarded. Because the true danger was never just in ideas, it was in experience. The hidden curriculum was this: you are a body, you are born in sin, you require guidance, and knowledge only has value if it's been approved. This doctrine may have worn theological robes in the 1600s, but today it wears lab coats or sits behind university podiums, and still, the gatekeeping remains. How much of what you believe is based on evidence, and how much is based on repetition, on credential, on consensus? Because the hidden curriculum teaches you not to question. It teaches you to obey, politely, to debate within the frame, to never touch the edges of the page, but the mystics touched it, the Gnostics crossed it, and the Jesuits did everything they could to erase their footprints, not by burning books, but by replacing them, by creating a world where the invisible hand never has to show itself. And if you grow up in that world, you think it's the only one, but the soul remembers. It knows when something's missing. It feels the blank spaces between the facts. And when that silence grows loud enough, you begin to ask the questions they never wanted you to ask. The kind that don't just change what you know, but how you know. And that is where the real education begins. He was born into the system, raised in the rhythm of incense and prayer, taught that obedience was sacred, that questioning was dangerous. But Salvador Freixedo didn't stay silent. Born in Spain in 1923, he entered the Society of Jesus Young, ambitious, devout, brilliant. He studied at some of the most prestigious Jesuit institutions in Europe and America, earning degrees in theology, philosophy, and psychology. To many, he was the model priest. To the church, a rising star. But behind his calm exterior, something had already begun to fracture. He saw too much, he read too deeply, and what he found didn't align with the story he was told. Inside the corridors of power, he witnessed the machinery of control. Not divine love, but hierarchy. Not spiritual liberation, but fear wrapped in ritual. He began to question the stories, not just the dogma, but the source. What if the God we were worshipping wasn't who we thought? In 1968, he published Mi Iglesia Duerme, My Church Sleeps. It was a spiritual Molotov cocktail, a direct attack on the institutional rigidity of the church, an expose of its loss of spiritual purpose. He was silenced, censored, expelled from the Jesuit order. But he didn't stop. Freixedo dove headfirst into the forbidden: UFOs, parapsychology, non-human intelligences. He began to see a larger pattern, one that connected ancient gods to modern phenomena. To him, the beings that humanity had worshipped for centuries may not have been divine at all. They were powerful, intelligent, capable of manipulating minds, shaping events, and feeding off belief. But they were not here to save us. They were here to harvest us. In books like Defendámonos de los Dioses, Let's Defend Ourselves from the Gods, he warned that religion was not always a path to the Creator, but sometimes a cage. That many spiritual traditions, especially those enforced with fear, blood, and obedience, were not divinely inspired. They were engineered. He wrote of a cosmic farm where humanity's emotions, energy, and suffering were harvested by intelligences that moved behind the veil. His claims were outrageous to some, blasphemous to others, but always precise, well-researched, uncomfortably logical, because he wasn't a conspiracy theorist. He was a trained Jesuit, an insider, a man who had lived behind the curtain and chose to walk away from it. He paid the price: isolation, ridicule, exile. But he never stopped telling the truth as he saw it. And in his defiance, he offered something more than exposure. He offered a mirror, not to condemn belief, but to awaken it, to show us that real faith, real truth, doesn't fear the question. It requires it. We've been taught to look up, to associate the sky with holiness, to believe that anything descending from above must be sacred. But what if that belief was part of the design? Salvador Freixedo dared to ask a question most wouldn't even whisper. What if some of the beings we've called angels were never sent to save us? What if light itself could deceive? Across cultures, across time, the pattern repeats. Beings from the sky, bringers of knowledge, givers of law, demanders of worship. They arrive with fire, with thunder, with promises, and in exchange, they ask for obedience, sacrifice, fear. In ancient Sumer, they were the Anunnaki, sky gods who created humans to serve them. In the Bible, they were the Elohim, plural in form, powerful, jealous, and often wrathful. In the book of Enoch, the Watchers, angels who descended, took human wives and taught forbidden arts. These were not tales of benevolence. They were stories of control, of interference, of beings that positioned themselves as gods, but acted like lords over livestock. Freixedo studied these myths, not as metaphor, but as memory, a record of ancient contact. And he found something disturbing. The more he looked, the more he saw the same signature entities demanding worship, entities feeding off devotion, fear, and pain, entities obsessed with ritual, blood, and obedience. He began to see the Bible not as a spiritual revelation, but as a historical document, one written under the influence of powerful, non-human intelligences. He pointed to Yahweh, the Old Testament God who ordered genocide, demanded sacrifices, and declared himself the only true authority. Was this the voice of the infinite, or a local power being presenting itself as the divine? Freixedo was careful. He never denied the existence of God. In fact, he insisted there was a higher source, pure, radiant, infinite. But between humanity and that source, there were layers, hierarchies, gatekeepers, and not all of them were benevolent. Some were parasites, spiritual entities posing as saviors, whose true purpose was not to elevate the soul, but to trap it. And once you allow something into your belief system, once you give it devotion, you create a connection, a line of energy, a contract. This, Freixedo said, is the hidden danger, not possession in the Hollywood sense, but influence. You think you're worshipping the divine, when in truth, you're feeding something that only wants to keep you small. This was his most terrifying conclusion. Not all angels serve the light. Some wear light as a disguise. And in a world trained to kneel at the first sign of glory, very few ever look closely enough to tell the difference. We imagine the world is ruled by men, presidents, prime ministers, CEOs, and kings. We point at the ones with power, the ones on stages, behind podiums, or on screens. But those are just the faces. The real power doesn't hold press conferences. It doesn't sign executive orders. It whispers behind locked doors. And sometimes, it doesn't speak in words at all. Salvador Freixedo came to believe that many of the world's elites, from popes to politicians, from media moguls to royal bloodlines, were not the origin of power, but the middlemen. In his writings, he described what he called the invisible owners of the earth. Not a cabal of humans, something older, non-human intelligences that have guided and distorted human civilization from the shadows. To some, this sounds like science fiction, but across myth, scripture, and history, the fingerprints remain. Pharaohs claimed to descend from gods. Roman emperors were deified, kings ruled by divine right. And even today, presidents swear oaths on ancient books to unseen forces. Why? Because authority craves legitimacy, and the highest legitimacy comes from something greater than man. But what if that something greater wasn't what it claimed to be? Freixedo warned that behind the elite, there are entities, ancient, cunning, who trade influence for obedience, who offer power, but demand access to thought, to emotion, to the collective will of humanity. He wrote of agreements, not signed with ink, but made in secrecy through rituals that trace back to Babylon, to Ur, to the forgotten temples, of blood and fire. Today, the rituals are hidden, disguised as diplomacy, as culture, as entertainment. But the result is the same. The world is kept in fear. The masses are distracted, and suffering, the real currency, is harvested in plain sight. Wars erupt, economies collapse, and behind the scenes, those who pull the strings remain untouchable because they were never part of the surface game. They operate from the deep, and those who serve them, whether knowingly or not, are rewarded with power, status, and protection. Freixedo was not alone in this view. Researchers like David Icke, Jordan Maxwell, and others have echoed the same conclusion, that humanity is not just governed, it is managed by forces that move through bloodlines, symbols, and secret oaths. And until we look beyond the face on the throne, we'll never see the hand that placed it there. Because some kings are chosen, others are installed, and the real rulers, they never needed to be seen, only served. They called them watchers, not gods, not angels, something in between. In the Book of Enoch, one of the oldest mystical texts ever written, these beings descended from the heavens. They saw the beauty of human women, took them as wives, and birthed a hybrid race known as the Nephilim. But they didn't come just for desire. They came with knowledge, forbidden knowledge, the art of war, alchemy, astrology, metallurgy, root cutting, enchantments. They gifted the tools of civilization, but at a cost, because knowledge is never neutral. It can heal or control. The Watchers were cast down, punished by heaven for interfering with Earth, locked away in realms unseen, or so we were told. But the world they left behind still bears their mark, from the stepped pyramids of Babylon to the microchips of Silicon Valley. The same architecture persists, the same obsession with symbols, the same reverence for power, the same manipulation of energy. And Freixedo believed they never truly left. They just changed costumes. Ancient robes became lab coats. The temples became towers. The rituals became algorithms. Because influence is easier when your presence is unrecognized. He argued that these entities learned to evolve with us, to hide within systems, to ride the currents of our progress, to whisper through culture, through innovation, through ideology. The gods of Sumer are gone in name, but not in function. In Mesopotamia, they ruled through fear. In Rome, through conquest. Today, through information. They no longer need altars. They have screens. They no longer need high priests. They have programmers, and their grip is deeper than ever, because now we invite them in, willingly, through contracts we never read, terms we never question, ideas we download without noticing. The Watchers have become Watchers once again, but this time through lenses, through devices, through code. And as we stare into the digital abyss, we don't realize something is staring back. Not all technology is created in a vacuum. Not all innovation is for our liberation. Sometimes it is another form of binding, another cage, wired, efficient, invisible. Freixedo wasn't anti-science. He was anti-deception. He believed true progress is spiritual, that evolution is not measured by data speed, but by awareness. Because if ancient entities could guide empires in the past, what makes us think they're not guiding them now? Not through thrones, but through tech, through trends, through thoughts we think are our own. The Watchers never left. They just adapted. And the question is no longer whether they're here. It's whether we're still asleep. In the system they helped build, in the ancient world, architecture was sacred. Temples weren't just buildings. They were mirrors of the cosmos, constructed with intention, aligned to stars, designed to channel energy. The high domes, the spiral staircases, the echo of chants within stone chambers, all of it had purpose. A temple wasn't where you went to find God. It was where you became a vessel for the divine. But something changed. Over time, the sacred became political. The architecture shifted, and the structures of spirit were replaced by structures of power. Today, the new temples rise in concrete and steel. Bright lights, digital screens, crowds packed into engineered arenas. They are not called temples anymore. They are called stadiums, concert halls, megachurches, superdomes. And yet, the energy is the same. Thousands gather, hearts sink. Bodies move as one. Emotion peaks, joy, rage, worship, all elevated to a fever pitch. And above it all, something watches, something feeds. Freixedo warned us about this. He believed that mass gatherings, far from being just entertainment, were energy rituals, not in the conscious sense, but in their effect. Because the human energy field is real, it can be measured, it can be amplified. And when thousands come together in synchronized emotion, it becomes a surge, a harvest. In ancient times, sacrifices were physical. Now they are emotional, spiritual, vibrational. We no longer spill blood at the altar. We spill presence, attention, intensity, and in the invisible layers of this world, something still collects it. Why do stadiums echo the architecture of cathedrals? Why do churches look more like theaters? Why does every institution of mass influence rely on the same ingredients? Sound, light, ritual, focus. It's because the principle hasn't changed. Create a charged space, direct the energy, extract the result. In some stadiums, it's devotion to a team. In others, to a god, or a brand, or a personality. But the emotional frequency is the offering. And most people never realize they're participating in a rite. Freixedo believed that the intelligences who once demanded temples have not disappeared. They've evolved. And now they receive their offerings through applause, through chanting, through collective focus. Because energy doesn't need belief to flow. It just needs direction. And the question becomes, who's guiding it? Who benefits when millions tune in to the same fear, the same outrage, the same hero worship? We've replaced the sacred temple with the modern arena. But what if the altar never disappeared? What if the ritual simply changed shape? And what if the God never left? Not all communication happens with words. Some messages are older, quieter, and deeper. Symbols speak to a part of you that doesn't use language. They bypass logic, they slip past reason, and they settle in the subconscious. Long before textbooks and doctrine, ancient civilizations understood this. They carved spirals into stone, wove sacred geometry into temples, arranged cities according to celestial patterns. To them, a shape wasn't just a shape, it was a portal. A spiral signified the journey inward. A triangle, the bridge between heaven and earth. A circle, eternity, the infinite. And when arranged in the right order, these symbols did something more than inform. They activated. The Jesuits understood this. They studied the ancient languages of symbol. They learned how geometry could create resonance, how a space could be designed to elicit obedience, humility, awe. Look at the Vatican. Not just its paintings, its architecture. Domes that mirror the firmament. Obelisks placed with surgical precision. A cross, not only as a religious icon, but as a geometric weapon of focus. Every inch designed to evoke submission, to silence inner resistance, to condition the soul into receptivity. But the influence doesn't stop at churches. Today, the same principles are used in advertising, in branding, in politics. Corporate logos carry sigils. Many are ancient, trace back to alchemical glyphs, esoteric emblems, and Masonic geometry. Why does that matter? Because the subconscious doesn't filter for intention. It doesn't ask who made the symbol or why. It just responds. It opens, it absorbs, it obeys the pattern. That's why a logo can make you feel safe, why a shape can make you trust, why an unfamiliar design can trigger unease without you knowing why. Freixedo warned that modern rituals use symbolism more effectively than ancient priesthoods ever did, because now we're saturated. Billboards, apps, flashing icons, visual spells, and we welcome them. We decorate our lives with them, not realizing they're doing something to us. Sacred geometry, once used to awaken, is now used to condition, to reinforce systems of control, A ritual doesn't need robes and fire anymore. It needs a screen, a brand, a rhythm. Because modern magic is subtle, and when symbols are repeated enough, they don't just influence your choices, they shape your reality. This is the hidden language, the code beneath culture. And unless we learn to see it, we'll remain subject to it, controlled not by force, but by form. And the most powerful symbol is always the one you never realized was there. There's a name whispered in the shadows of ancient texts, a name not meant to inspire worship, but to sound a warning. The Demiurge. To the Gnostics, those early mystics of the 1st and 2nd centuries, this was not the creator in the highest sense, not the source, not the pure light beyond form. The Demiurge was a counterfeit god, an architect of illusion, a lesser being that mistook itself for the all. They said he fashioned this world, not as a gift, but as a cage, not from love, but from ignorance, and worse, he demanded to be worshipped. Yaldabaoth, Samael, the blind one. He goes by many names in Gnostic scriptures, but always the pattern is the same. A being who creates a material realm, detached from the true divine. A being who installs rulers, systems, structures to keep the soul asleep. He is arrogant, jealous, vengeful. Sound familiar? Freixedo saw the parallels. He read the Old Testament with new eyes, not as a story of divine providence, but as a manual of control. A God who demands blood, a God who punishes inquiry, a God who insists, "I am the Lord and there is no other." But the Gnostics disagreed. They believed there was another God, a hidden source, silent and infinite. Not male, not female, not form, just light, truth, gnosis. And between us and that truth stood the Demiurge. They said he forged the body, tied the soul to flesh, distracted us with suffering, with hierarchy, with endless cycles of birth and death. And he didn't work alone. He was surrounded by archons, invisible rulers, energetic parasites, beings whose sole task was to feed off the human mind. They influence through fear, through division, through confusion. They love order, but only the kind that enslaves. To the Gnostics, this wasn't myth. It was diagnosis, a blueprint for waking up. They taught that the spark of God, the real God, lives inside each of us, buried, forgotten, and the journey of life was to remember, to reclaim that spark, to reject the illusions, to see through the veil. Freixedo echoed this. He warned that our world, for all its beauty, might be a cleverly coded simulation, a stage designed to keep us watching shadows, a maze with no exit unless you wake up. And waking up isn't comfortable. It means questioning everything, even the voice that claims to be God. Because if this world was built by a false architect, then salvation doesn't come from outside it. It comes from within, from that place the archons can't touch, the spark they couldn't extinguish. Your true self, still waiting, still shining, still whispering, behind the veil. Most never question the God of the Old Testament. He is presented as absolute, singular, the one. But if you read carefully, the text tells a different story. Let us make man in our image. Let us go down and confuse their language. Who was the us? Who was Yahweh speaking to? Salvador Freixedo asked that question, and what he found shattered everything he had been taught. Yahweh, he concluded, was not the only one, not even the highest one. He was one among many, a powerful being, yes, a cosmic intelligence, perhaps, but divine in the ultimate sense. Freixedo dared to suggest that Yahweh, the central figure of Judeo-Christian tradition, may have been a localized entity, a tribal god, a commander, not a creator. He pointed to the blood sacrifices, the obsession with obedience, the wrath, the jealousy, the violence, plagues, wars, demands for absolute loyalty. Was this the behavior of pure source, or the demands of a being that needed worship, that fed on it? In the ancient Near East, many gods were like this. The Sumerians had Enlil and Enki. The Canaanites had Baal and Moloch. Each claimed dominion. Each required ritual. Each demanded blood. And Yahweh fit the pattern. He chose a people, gave them laws, promised protection in exchange for total submission. And when they strayed, he ordered massacres, commanded genocide, called for the slaughter of men, women, even children. Freixedo didn't say this to blaspheme. He said it to reveal something deeper, that perhaps humanity had mistaken power for divinity, authority for truth. He wrote that Yahweh may have been an advanced being, a non-human intelligence with vast control over the ancient world, but not God. Not the infinite, not the source beyond form, not the silent light that asks for nothing, but remembrance. And this conclusion, this quiet, forbidden thought, is what cost him everything. He was expelled from the church, branded a heretic, shunned by peers, silenced, because he questioned the unquestionable. He pulled back the curtain, and when he did, he saw others behind it, other gods, other beings, all competing for devotion, all crafting covenants, all demanding loyalty. What if the Bible is not a spiritual narrative, but a record of contact? What if Yahweh was real, but not alone? And what if many of the world's religions have been shaped by the echoes of beings who once walked among us, some with light, others with shadow, all wearing the mask of godhood? And if that's true, then maybe the question has never been, do you believe in God? But rather, which one? In the ancient world, sacrifice was not just ceremony, it was transaction, blood, fire, smoke. These were the currencies of communication, not metaphor, not symbol, but exchange. A ritual wasn't just a performance, it was a precise act, a way to open a channel between worlds. And through that channel, something passed. Life was taken, but something else was received. Freixedo studied this deeply, not just in the Bible, but across every ancient tradition, from the Aztecs and their stone altars, to the Hebrews and their tabernacle, from the Vedic fire pits to the Roman temples. Always the same structure, a chosen victim, a sacred flame, a rising smoke. The question was always the same. Why? Why did these gods, these powerful beings, require burnt offerings? Why did they demand not prayer, but blood? In Leviticus, Yahweh gives detailed instructions. How the animals should be cut, which organs to burn, what parts to offer, how the smoke should rise. This wasn't symbolic worship, this was recipe. Freixedo believed these beings were not spiritual metaphors, but real intelligences. And the sacrifices, not about devotion, about energy, because emotion has a frequency, fear, pain, surrender. When death is charged with reverence, the energy it releases becomes concentrated. And if something can absorb that frequency, if it can feed on it, then ritual becomes a harvest. The Aztecs believed the sun would not rise unless it was fed. Hearts cut from chests, lives offered to keep the sky alive. The Hebrews believed their sins were transferred to a goat or lamb, and that killing it would restore balance. But what if that balance was an illusion? What if the real function was hidden? Freixedo wrote that the gods of old were not moral judges. They were farmers, energy farmers, and humans were the crop. In his view, many ancient rituals were designed not by humans, but taught to them by the very beings who benefited. They instructed how to build the altar, where to stand, what to burn, and how to do it with awe, because awe amplifies energy, and the more emotion behind the act, the more powerful the offering. We'd like to think we've evolved, that blood rituals are a relic of the past, but war is still ritual. Mass shootings, public executions, even news cycles, looped trauma consumed daily, fear, shock, grief, still rising, still feeding something, just out of sight. The names may have changed, the language refined, but the system, it still runs, and the smoke, whether from a fire or a screen, still ascends. The only question is, who's still receiving it? The names were different, the languages, the rituals, the continents, but the design was the same. In ancient Egypt, priests offered wine, incense, and bulls to the gods. In Mesopotamia, blood ran in rivers beneath ziggurats. In India, fire rituals called yajnas echoed into the skies. In Mesoamerica, the Aztecs lifted still-beating hearts to the sun. And in medieval Europe, incense drifted over gilded altars as the body and blood of Christ were consumed. Different eras, different mythologies, same structure. Freixedo saw the pattern, a global web of worship with the same energetic footprint, an altar, a sacrifice, a priest, a crowd, and something watching. He believed that this wasn't cultural coincidence, it was coordination. That across the ages, human beings had been guided or manipulated to build similar systems of energetic offering. Each religion told its followers, this is the truth, this is the only way. But beneath the surface, they all shared the same mechanics. Sacred space, repetition, blood or symbolic death, emotional surrender. The priests spoke different names, the chants changed, but the energy moved the same way, and always upward. Freixedo wrote that these systems may have been seeded by the same invisible architects, not gods of love, but intelligences of control. Because once a system is embedded in the culture, in the architecture, the art, the language, it self-replicates. Parents pass it to children, empires fund its temples, kings consult its priests, and no one questions the root. Even within Christianity, the echoes remain. The Mass reenacts a sacrifice, the bread becomes flesh, the wine becomes blood, and every Sunday millions perform the ritual again, not metaphor, not theatre, but a metaphysical repetition of something far older. Look at the layout of the temples, raised platforms, central focus points, a division between the sacred and the profane. Why does every system have an intermediary? Why must the divine always be accessed? Through a representative? Why is direct communion always discouraged? Freixedo believed the answer was simple. Because the system was never built to connect you to the infinite. It was built to manage the current, to regulate the flow of energy, to keep you dependent on the middleman. The worshipper kneels, the priest lifts the offering, the crowd chants, the power rises, and something receives. This isn't faith, this is architecture, ritual engineering, a global design, repeating itself across cultures, each believing they are unique, when in truth, they are pieces in the same ancient game, a game that feeds on belief, and the only way out is to see the pattern before it performs itself through you. We like to believe that power changed hands, that the kings were overthrown, that the church lost its grip, that democracy gave voice to the people, that the prophets have become influencers, harmless, polished, controlled. But the current never stopped. It just changed robes. Freixedo saw it clearly. The faces on the throne may have changed, but the thrones themselves were never abandoned. They were simply upgraded, and the puppets now wear suits, cassocks, designer brands, presidents elected by public applause, popes elevated through sacred tradition, celebrities crowned by algorithms. But behind the charisma, the messaging is the same: obey, divide, consume, fear. Modern leaders don't need divine right. They need cameras. They don't quote scripture. They quote numbers, approval ratings, stock prices, surveys. And yet, their words still shape belief, still move millions, still dictate reality. Freixedo believed that many of these figures, whether knowingly or not, are conduits, not creators of power, but vessels for it. They channel something older, an ancient agenda, once enforced through ritual and sword, now delivered through screens and sound bites. Think of the rallies, the staged spectacles, the perfectly timed crises, the emotional manipulation, hope, outrage, devotion. Is it politics or ritual? The energy moves the same. A leader speaks, the crowd responds, the tension builds, and the collective focus becomes electric. Someone benefits from that current. It's not just the person on the stage, it's what moves through them. Freixedo studied how religious figures, especially popes, wield enormous spiritual authority, but often in the service of control, not liberation. He questioned why popes have thrones, armies, diplomatic immunity, why the Vatican has its own bank, its own intelligence network, its own archives, locked tight. He saw celebrities the same way, modern-day demigods, worshipped, followed, mimicked. Their influence is spiritual. They shape identity, desire, and values. They don't need to preach, they perform. And in that performance, they transmit culture, belief, control. And what if, just like the priesthoods of old, they are being guided? Not all consciously, not all willingly, but the system selects them, elevates them, uses them, because it knows how to speak to the masses, not through reason, but rhythm, not through truth, but spectacle. And when the right figure appears, the perfect blend of charm, controversy, and command, millions follow, even if they don't know where they're going, even if they're walking into a trap. Freixedo's warning was simple. Modern prophets are still among us, but many of them have strings, and if you don't know who's pulling them, you may mistake the puppet for the source of the voice. We've been taught that pain is accidental, that war is unfortunate, that suffering is just the collateral damage of progress. But what if that's not true? What if fear is not a byproduct, but a resource? What if pain isn't the cost, but the goal? Freixedo believed that suffering was not merely human misfortune, it was the offering, the fuel. He saw a pattern hidden beneath every empire, every religion, every ideology that ever demanded sacrifice, whether in blood or in obedience. And he asked the forbidden question: who benefits from human suffering? Not just in theory, not in the abstract, but energetically, because energy is real, and emotion is not just a feeling, it's a frequency. Fear has a signature, so does rage, so does grief. And when amplified, especially in groups, it becomes something more. It becomes harvestable. Ancient cultures knew this. That's why rituals were timed with eclipses. That's why mass sacrifices were held at solstices. Because the energy had to peak, the moment had to open, and whatever stood behind the veil had to receive. Freixedo believed that many non-human intelligences, what he called the invisible owners of the earth, thrive on this energy, not because they are evil in the way we understand, but because that's how they sustain themselves. They don't feed on food, they feed on frequency. And the densest, richest frequency of all is suffering. That's why fear is constantly broadcast, not just through war, but through media, through division, through illness, through scarcity. The goal is to keep humanity in a low vibrational state, to generate a continual hum of despair, worry, and helplessness. Because when people are afraid, they're malleable, suggestible, divided, and above all, they emit. Freixedo warned that the systems we think are broken are actually working perfectly. They weren't built to uplift us. They were built to drain us, to keep us in loops, repeating trauma, recycling fear, every headline, every ritualized tragedy, every once-in-a-generation crisis serves a dual purpose: to maintain control and to collect the emotional charge. You are not just watching it, you are participating. The moment you react, when your heart rate spikes, when your stomach sinks, something receives that signal. And if enough of us emit at once, it becomes a storm. That's what mass fear events really are: energetic detonations. And someone is always on the other side, listening, absorbing, feeding. Freixedo did not write this to terrify. He wrote it to free us. Because once you understand, that fear is a product. You can stop buying it. You can stop feeding the system with your life force. And you can choose, moment by moment, to emit something else, something they cannot eat. Love, clarity, sovereignty, the frequencies that end the harvest. Not all rituals are grand. Some are quiet, personal, hidden behind closed doors, but those are often the most powerful. The Jesuits had one such practice, rarely spoken of, never mentioned in catechism. It was not for the masses, it was for initiates, those being trained not just to teach, but to transform. They called it the mirror exercise. On paper, it sounded innocent, a reflection technique, a meditative method for self-awareness. The Jesuit would sit in silence and face a mirror and stare for hours. No talking, no movement, just gaze. At first, the goal seemed noble: to face the self, to witness one's own reflection without judgment, to dissolve the ego, to confront inner shadows. But Freixedo, who went through the ritual himself, began to notice something else, something unsettling. He described how after prolonged focus, the face in the mirror began to shift. Features blurred, eyes hollowed. The reflection became foreign. What looked back was not just a face, it was a presence. The exercise, he realized, wasn't just about seeing the self. It was about opening something. Because a mirror is more than glass. It is a portal. In esoteric traditions across the world, mirrors are known to be gateways to the subconscious, to the astral, to other dimensions entirely. They are used in scrying, in shadow work, in necromantic rites. The Jesuits, known for their mastery of spiritual psychology, understood this. They knew the mirror was not passive. It was a conductor. Freixedo believed the exercise was a way to erase identity dash, to thin the veil between the physical and the unseen. But to what end? Was it to deepen communion with God, or to fracture the psyche, to prepare the vessel for something else? Because when the self is stripped away, something must fill the void. And if intention is not pure, if the structure is built on obedience and guilt, what enters that space may not be light. Freixedo spoke of altered states, of voices, of presences felt behind the glass. This was not metaphor, it was real, and he wasn't alone. Throughout the Order's history, there were whispers. Recruits who became disoriented, who heard things during their reflections, who emerged, changed. It was described as enlightenment, but some never returned the same. The mirror exercise was never banned, never discredited. It simply faded into silence. And perhaps that's the most telling part. Because true spiritual growth does not require a portal. It does not demand you dissolve yourself into nothingness. It invites you to remember who you are. But the mirror, especially when weaponized, asks you to forget. And when you forget who you are, you become vulnerable to anyone who remembers. There's a silence that surrounds certain truths, not because they are unimportant, but because they are too dangerous to name. Freixedo didn't just study individual rituals, he studied systems, entire institutions, vast, complex, seemingly untouchable. And what he found was disturbing. He believed that many of the world's most powerful institutions, governments, religious orders, media conglomerates, are not merely corrupt. They are possessed, not in the dramatic theatrical sense, not spinning heads or ancient curses, but spiritually, energetically, influenced not by men, but by intelligences, older, unseen, deliberate. Because once a system is built, it becomes a vessel. And what occupies that vessel determines what it serves. A government may claim to serve the people, but who does it really serve? When it prioritizes war over peace, division over unity, control over truth, a church may wear the cross, but what God is it invoking? When it hides abuse, hoards wealth, and silences mystics, a media network may say it informs, but what frequency is it transmitting? When it amplifies fear, ridicule, and despair. Freixedo traced the origins, and time and again he found a familiar pattern. These institutions were founded on ideals, but they were infiltrated by energies. In ancient traditions, it was well understood that spirits can inhabit places. A temple could be sacred or cursed. A house could feel heavy. A building could absorb trauma and echo it back. Now imagine an entire system, an empire, a global structure, built on fear, sustained by secrecy, powered by belief. What kind of spirit would it attract? Freixedo called them intelligences. Not angels, not demons, just entities, with their own motives, their own appetites. He believed these beings found access through ritual, through architecture, through symbols, through agreement, because influence requires permission, and institutions give it through action, through repetition, through the decisions of their leaders, decisions made in back rooms, beneath cathedrals, inside boardrooms. Not all institutions are evil, but many are no longer guided by human will alone. They have become vessels, hosts, and those who rise to the top, the politicians, the preachers, the moguls, may not even realize they're following instructions that were never truly theirs, because once the system is animated, it sustains itself. It whispers through policies, through traditions, through sacred texts and slogans. And unless you learn to see the difference between the outer shell and the inner presence, you will mistake influence for leadership. Freixedo didn't say this to instill paranoia. He said it to awaken discernment, to remind us that not all authority is spiritual, not all tradition is holy, and not all institutions serve the light. Some are ruled from within. They tried to bury him, not with dirt, but with silence. Salvador Freixedo didn't just walk away from the Jesuits. He wrote, and what he wrote was never meant to reach the public, not because it was false, but because it was too true. His books were banned in multiple countries, blacklisted by Catholic institutions, labeled as dangerous by those who feared what they revealed, and still they survived. Scattered in underground circles, whispered about in ufology conferences, circulated as forbidden maps for those brave enough to read between the lines. In Mi Iglesia Duerme, My Church Sleeps, Freixedo exposed the spiritual coma inside the Catholic institution. He didn't attack God. He revealed how the Church had replaced God with control. Then came Defendámonos de los Dioses. Let's defend ourselves from the gods. This was no longer critique, it was war. He claimed that humanity has been manipulated for millennia by non-human intelligences, that the gods of myth, the ones we worshipped, obeyed and sacrificed to, were not divine, but parasitic. He didn't stop there. In La Granja Humana, the human farm, he argued that Earth itself is a controlled environment, that our wars, our divisions, our suffering aren't accidents. They are cultivated. Emotional energy, especially fear, is the harvest. And belief systems, from religion to politics to science, are the infrastructure. Each book was a match, thrown into the archives of history, and institutions panicked. They labeled him fringe. They discredited his credentials. They warned others not to engage. But Freixedo was no conspiracy theorist. He was educated, initiated, an insider. He had stood inside the halls of Vatican power. He had read documents that never reach public eyes. He had seen what most are trained to ignore. And in his books, he named the names. He connected the rituals. He traced the symbols. He revealed how collective programming is not random, but deliberate. From the phrases we repeat, to the holidays we celebrate, to the thoughts we believe are our own. The system has written its script into the human psyche. Freixedo's work was never meant to entertain. It was meant to break the spell, to act as a mirror, a siren, a rupture in the narrative. And for those with eyes to see, his books were not threats. They were invitations to question, to remember, to reclaim the voice that was buried beneath programming. Because the truth is, they didn't fear his books. They feared what would happen if you read them, and even more, if you believed them. They tried to bury him, not with dirt, but with silence. Salvador Freixedo didn't just walk away from the Jesuits. He wrote, and what he wrote was never meant to reach the public, not because it was false, but because it was too true. His books were banned in multiple countries, blacklisted by Catholic institutions, labeled as dangerous by those who feared what they revealed. And still, they survived. Scattered in underground circles, whispered about in ufology conferences, circulated as forbidden maps for those brave enough to read between the lines. In Mi Iglesia Duerme, My Church Sleeps, Freixedo exposed the spiritual coma inside the Catholic institution. He didn't attack God. He revealed how the Church had replaced God with control. Then came Defendámonos de los dioses. Let's defend ourselves from the gods. This was no longer critique, it was war. He claimed that humanity has been manipulated for millennia by non-human intelligences, that the gods of myth, the ones we worshipped, obeyed and sacrificed to, were not divine, but parasitic. He didn't stop there. In La Granja Humana, the human farm, he argued that Earth itself is a controlled environment, that our wars, our divisions, our suffering aren't accidents. They are cultivated. Emotional energy, especially fear, is the harvest. And belief systems, from religion to politics to science, are the infrastructure. Each book was a match, thrown into the archives of history, and institutions panicked. They labeled him fringe. They discredited his credentials. They warned others not to engage. But Freixedo was no conspiracy theorist. He was educated, initiated, an insider. He had stood inside the halls of Vatican power. He had read documents that never reach public eyes. He had seen what most are trained to ignore. And in his books, he named the names. He connected the rituals. He traced the symbols. He revealed how collective programming is not random, but deliberate. From the phrases we repeat, to the holidays we celebrate, to the thoughts we believe are our own. The system has written its script into the human psyche. Freixedo's work was never meant to entertain. It was meant to break the spell, to act as a mirror, a siren, a rupture in the narrative. And for those with eyes to see, his books were not threats. They were invitations to question, to remember, to reclaim the voice that was buried beneath programming. Because the truth is, they didn't fear his books. They feared what would happen if you read them, and even more, if you believed them. They used to descend in fire. Now they arrive in light. Their names have changed, but their presence has not. Once they were gods, then demons, then angels, now extraterrestrials. The myth evolves, the masks change, but the game remains the same. Freixedo was among the first to say it out loud, that many so-called UFO sightings were not evidence of distant civilizations, but signs that the same intelligences that once shaped ancient religions were still here, still watching, still intervening, still harvesting. He wasn't alone. Jacques Vallée, John Keel, even Carl Jung, they all pointed to something beyond the simple alien narrative. Not beings from other planets, but beings from other dimensions, other densities, other states of consciousness, entities that can shift form, that appear according to belief, that manipulate perception like artists. In ancient Mesopotamia, they descended from the sky with wings of fire. In medieval Europe, they rode black horses through storms. In the 20th century, they came in discs. The question isn't what they look like, it's what they want. Freixedo believed that most encounters, especially those involving paralysis, missing time, or psychic intrusion, are not scientific probes. They are spiritual abductions, experiments in fear, manipulations of consciousness, interactions designed to extract energy. He warned that many UFO phenomena are the continuation of the same presence, that demanded sacrifice in temples, that whispered to prophets, that dictated laws through thunder and flame. But now, with the modern mind no longer impressed by myth, they wear a different costume. Steel, light, technology. because the myth must always evolve to stay effective, and the deception, it's perfect. By presenting themselves as advanced civilizations, these beings avoid spiritual scrutiny. They become objects of curiosity, not reverence, not fear. We chase them, we theorize, we point telescopes to the stars, while they move silently through consciousness, because their access point is not space, it's belief. And when belief is directed at them, whether in fear, fascination, or worship, the current flows, and something feeds. Governments have known this. That's why the UFO topic has been managed, classified, slow dripped into public awareness, not to prepare us, but to control the narrative. Because if people ever connected the dots, that the gods of old, the demons of folklore, and the aliens of today may be the same force, it would change everything. Freixedo's warning was clear. The deception is not that they exist. It's what they are and why they come, not to enlighten, but to entangle, not to liberate, but to observe, manipulate, and feed. And unless we awaken to the pattern, we will continue calling them by new names, while forgetting they never left. You are free. That's the first lie. You choose, you vote, you buy, you scroll. But freedom is not the presence of options. It's the absence of manipulation. And today, manipulation is everywhere. Not through force, but through suggestion. Not through fear of punishment, but through pleasure. Freixedo warned that the new chains would not be forged in iron. They would be built from language, wrapped in convenience, dripped in dopamine. The systems of control no longer need cathedrals. They have feeds, notifications, endless content. Every time you scroll, you are being trained. Not in facts, in rhythm, swipe, react, consume, repeat. Each loop rewires the brain. Each click teaches the algorithm what you love, what you fear, what you want before you even know it. And so, what appears before you feels like a choice. But it was delivered, curated, inserted. The illusion of free will becomes a dance of conditioned impulses, and no one notices, because distraction has replaced direction, stimulation has replaced stillness, and language has been weaponized. Freixedo spoke often of the power of words. He understood that language shapes thought, and thought shapes perception. Control the language. And you don't need to censor. You just reframe. War becomes peacekeeping. Censorship becomes safety. Obedience becomes compassion. And slowly, truth becomes fluid, malleable. A mood. This is how mind control works in the modern world. Not with violence, with narrative. Not through commandments carved in stone, but through trends whispered in hashtags. And always with reward. Every like, every comment, every badge, streak, or ping is designed to hit the brain's pleasure center, to release dopamine, to create a loop. And when the loop is strong enough, you won't need to be told what to do. You'll do it automatically, willingly, eagerly. That's the new genius of control. It doesn't restrict your choices, it overwhelms them. Until you stop asking what's true and start choosing what's easy. But Freixedo believed there's a way out, not by rejecting technology, but by remembering who you are, beneath the noise, by reclaiming stillness, silence, and sovereignty, by watching your thoughts instead of obeying them, by becoming aware of what pulls your strings. Because once you see the illusion of choice, you can begin to choose again, not from impulse, but from presence. And in that presence, true freedom begins, the kind they can't package, can't sell, can't track, the kind they fear. It's not your money they want, not your land, not even your vote. What they want is your energy. Freixedo believed that consciousness is the most valuable resource in existence, more than oil, more than gold, more than data. Because consciousness is generative, it creates, it sustains, it radiates. And when it's focused, when it's charged with emotion, it becomes power. That power can move mountains, heal bodies, awaken the sleeping, or it can be harvested. Freixedo described the soul, not as a metaphor, but as an engine, a vibrational generator of light, intention, and awareness. And if that engine is hijacked, if it can be kept spinning in loops of fear, guilt, and distraction, its energy can be siphoned, not through wires, through resonance. He wasn't the only one to say it. Gnostic texts spoke of archons, who farm human souls for psychic nourishment. Carlos Castaneda described flyers that feed on our awareness like parasites. Even the Matrix, though fictional, echoes this truth. Humans used as batteries, not fiction, revelation through disguise. Because in the hidden economy of the unseen, your attention is currency, your suffering is fuel, and your life force is the product. Freixedo called this the human farm. Not as insult, as insight. He believed the structures we serve, the systems we pledge loyalty to, are not neutral. They are part of an energetic design, a blueprint crafted not by human hands, but by intelligences that understand how to extract without being seen, work, consume, worry, fear, repeat, not just to keep you controlled, but to keep you producing. Because every breakdown, every heartbreak, every war and collapse releases energy. And that energy goes somewhere. You don't see where. You're not supposed to. You just feel tired, empty, disconnected. That's the harvest. And the soul, trapped in cycles of reactivity, doesn't remember that it was never meant to be a battery. It was meant to be a star, self-generating, self-guiding, untouchable. But you were taught to plug in to external gods, to institutions, to ideologies that siphon your spirit in exchange for illusion. And now they no longer need temples. They have screens, terms and conditions, false choice. But Freixedo left us with a clue. The system only works when you don't know who you are. When you remember, when you feel the current of your own awareness, the circuit breaks. You stop emitting for them. You start glowing for yourself. And that, in the end, is the liberation they fear most. Not all vows are spoken in light. Some are taken in the dark, behind stone doors, beneath vaulted ceilings, far from the eyes of the world. The Jesuit oath is no ordinary pledge. To most, the Society of Jesus is known for education, discipline, and loyalty to the Pope. But Freixedo, who once belonged to that society, learned that there are layers to that loyalty. He saw what few ever see. He remembered what others were trained to forget. The public oath is measured, polished, acceptable. But the private oath, the one whispered in shadows, speaks of something else, a higher obedience, one that surpasses even papal authority. Allegiance not just to Rome, but to a hidden command. Throughout history, fragments of this extreme oath have surfaced, described in congressional records, referenced by ex-members, denied, of course, by official channels. But the language is unmistakable. To infiltrate, to deceive, to destroy, to act without question, sworn to become all things to all men, to be Protestant among Protestants, Muslim among Muslims, to enter governments, schools, even churches of rivals, and dismantle them from within, not for ideology, for obedience, because the true mission was never about faith. It was about control. Freixedo believed that this loyalty wasn't simply to the Pope, that beyond the visible hierarchy of the Church, there exists a deeper chain of command, not made of cardinals or bishops, but of unseen forces, ancient intelligences that use spiritual systems as vehicles for their agenda. He wrote that the Jesuit structure is a mirror of a deeper order, an invisible pyramid with human agents at the base and something non-human at the top. To reach the upper levels of this structure requires more than intelligence, more than dedication. It requires surrender of will, of identity, of soul. Not all who rise through the Jesuit ranks understand what they serve, but some do, and those few are not like other men, because to serve a shadowed hierarchy requires a shadowed heart. Freixedo believed this is why Jesuits were placed strategically throughout history, not just in churches, but in empires. They advised kings, managed revolutions, infiltrated resistance, always with the same mission: to install an invisible governance beneath the visible one that cannot be voted out, one that doesn't answer to the people, one that serves something ancient. And if that oath still echoes, if that hidden allegiance still guides decisions at the highest levels, then we are not being ruled by those we think. We are being administered by a priesthood of servants, sworn not to truth, but to secrecy. And the only way to break their power is to shine light on what was always meant to remain hidden. It slithers through every myth, coils through every scripture, painted on temple walls, carved into stone, whispered in parables. The serpent, feared, revered, blamed, worshipped, but always there. In Eden, it tempts Eve with forbidden knowledge. In Egypt, it crowns the Pharaoh's brow as the Uraeus. In India, it becomes Kundalini, the coiled energy at the base of the spine. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, is the god of wisdom, of sky and earth. Why? Why would one symbol appear in every civilization, on every continent across millennia? Freixedo believed the answer wasn't theological, it was energetic. The serpent wasn't just a character, it was a code, a key, a signal that something hidden was being revealed, because the snake is more than skin. It is the pulse of energy through the body. It is the movement of DNA, the double helix spiraling like coiled serpents. It is the whisper of transformation, of death and rebirth. But it is also a boundary, a guardian. In some traditions, the serpent guards treasure. In others, it guards truth. And always, it coils at the threshold, between ignorance and awakening. Freixedo saw this duality. The serpent was not good or evil. It was sacred and dangerous, because knowledge, once tasted, cannot be untasted. And those who hold power have always feared what the serpent represents: liberation. In the Garden of Eden, it is the serpent, not God, who tells the humans they can become like gods themselves, not through rebellion, through remembrance. And for that, the serpent is cursed, demonized, turned into the villain of the human story. But what if the villain was the one who wanted us to know? What if the real danger wasn't the snake, but the one who wanted the garden to remain closed? Freixedo believed that ancient priesthoods didn't just warn against the serpent, They encoded its meaning because the serpent also symbolizes energy, life force, awakening. And once that energy is activated within the spine, within the psyche, within the soul, a human being becomes dangerous to the system, unprogrammable, unshakable, awake. That is the hidden meaning, not a fall from grace, but a rise into awareness. The serpent is not your enemy. It is the current beneath illusion, the riddle coiled inside the myth. And that is why, in every ancient story, someone always tries to kill it, but the serpent never dies. It transforms, it sheds, it returns, because truth, like the serpent, always finds a way back. Beneath the streets of Rome, under the weight of stone and centuries, lies a silence thicker than darkness, the Vatican Apostolic Archive. Once called the Secret Archive, now rebranded, gently, strategically. But the truth remains. It is the most heavily guarded collection of documents in the religious world. Over 50 miles of shelving, hundreds of thousands of volumes, much of it untouched, unread, unknown, and yet we are told it is simply history, ecclesiastical letters, ancient records, administrative debris. Freixedo didn't believe that. He believed the real treasures are not relics, but revelations, accounts of contact, rituals lost to time, codices from early Christians whose gospels were erased, proof of interference by powers the church has always known about, but never acknowledged. And buried deeper still, the documents that name them, the ones that connect the gods of Sumer, the angels of Genesis, and the so-called demons of the medieval age, into a single unbroken lineage of control. The church never claimed the archive was empty, only that it was too sacred, too fragile, too dangerous for public eyes. But what is more dangerous? The words on those pages, or the lies we were told in their absence? Freixedo was convinced that what rests beneath the Vatican is not simply forgotten history, but intentional omission, not because we are not ready, but because someone is not willing. Imagine what would happen if the world discovered that much of what it worships is built on manipulated truth, if the serpent was never evil, if the fallen angels were not demons but exiled teachers, if the gods of the Old Testament were never gods at all. That's what may lie in those vaults. Writings from mystics silenced by inquisitions, scrolls from pre-Christian temples, blueprints of energy rituals that shaped nations through obedience, not divinity. And it's not just spiritual history that's hidden. Freixedo believed there are documents about ancient technologies, celestial maps, and contact events, some buried in symbolic language, others shockingly direct. Why else would they lock away centuries of knowledge while preaching transparency? Why else would only a handful of chosen scholars be allowed to enter under supervision, without phones, without copies? It's not about protection, it's about preservation of power. Because if humanity ever truly knew who it was, what it came from, and what forces have shaped its beliefs, the spell would break, and those who held power, by controlling the past, would lose the future. That's why the archive remains silent, not because it has nothing to say, but because its voice could shatter worlds. There is something inside you. They have spent lifetimes trying to make you forget. A spark, a flame, a presence that cannot be touched by ritual, broken by trauma, or erased by fear. It has no name in the most traditions, but the Gnostics called it the divine spark, The Buddhists called it the Buddha nature. Mystics called it the light within, and it is yours. Unconditionally, silently, always. Freixedo believed that all systems of control, whether religious, political, or psychological, were built to distract from that spark, to replace it with authority, to cover it with guilt, to drown it in noise. Because once you touch it, you stop looking outside. You no longer seek permission. You no longer need to be saved. You remember, you were never lost. The Gnostics said the world was a prison, built by a false creator, the Demiurge, and that the soul's escape was not through obedience, but through gnosis, inner knowing. They were hunted, burned, erased from Scripture, because they taught that God does not live in the sky, but in you. The Buddhists said suffering was illusion, that ego, craving, fear, are veils that blind the mind, and that liberation is not given, it is uncovered. Mystics from every tradition went into deserts, caves, cathedrals, or temples, only to find that the real sanctuary was silence. And when they returned, they carried a message. You are not broken. You are not unworthy. You are not here to serve gods that punish or systems that feed on your shame. You are here to remember. That is the revolution Freixedo pointed toward. Not rebellion with swords or fire, but a quiet, unstoppable awakening. That begins from within. Because once you feel the spark, once you witness it in stillness, the spell begins to break. The guilt loses its grip. The fear fades. The systems that once loomed large shrink into symbols, and you no longer follow blindly. You begin to walk with clarity, with sovereignty, with flame. That is why the mystics were silenced. That is why the Gnostic Gospels were buried. That is why silence is so rare in the modern world, because stillness leads to remembrance, and remembrance leads to freedom, not freedom of body, freedom of soul, a soul that knows. It does not need to be told what it is, a soul that burns with the light of something eternal, not gifted, not earned, simply present, waiting for you to see it. And once you do, nothing outside of you will ever have power over you again. In the past, they fought for your land, then your labor, then your loyalty. Now, they fight for your attention, not because it's trendy, because it's sacred. Freixedo believed that consciousness, pure awareness, is the most powerful force in the universe. Wherever it flows, energy follows, and whatever holds it controls reality. So the new war isn't on battlefields, it's on screens, in feeds, in the space between one swipe and the next. It's not waged with bullets, it's waged with algorithms. Each scroll, each tap, each subtle pause on an image is data, and that data trains the machine. It learns your rhythm, your fears, your curiosities, and it gives you exactly what keeps you hooked. Because attention, once captured, becomes a leash. And most people don't even notice the collar. The algorithm doesn't care what you believe, only what keeps you engaged. Outrage, jealousy, addiction, comparison. The same emotional frequencies ancient entities fed on are now coded into your daily experience. And the device in your hand, it's not neutral. It's an altar, a confessional, a weapon. The new priest doesn't wear robes. It wears a server rack, and it doesn't absolve you. It categorizes you. Freixedo saw this coming before most did. He wrote that spiritual control in the modern age would no longer require religion, only distraction. Because when the soul forgets itself, when it's pulled into 1,000 tiny fragments of focus, it becomes disempowered, scattered, tired, disconnected, and that's when it becomes most vulnerable. This is not just about technology, it's about design. Everything is built to keep you looking outward, to stop you from going inward, to keep the spark from awakening, because an awakened soul is the one thing the system can't track. And when enough people wake up, when enough begin to reclaim their attention, their time, their presence, the entire structure begins to fall. But until then, the war continues, and the battlefield is silent, personal, invisible, every moment you open your phone, every time you scroll instead of breathe, every time you let something else decide what you should see, you are giving away your sacred fire, not forever, but long enough to forget that it's yours. Freixedo didn't tell us to run from technology. He told us to become conscious of it, to reclaim attention as a spiritual act. Because in the end, what you give your awareness to becomes your God. And if you don't choose that God deliberately, the system will choose it for you. It doesn't start with protest or revolution or fire in the streets. It starts in silence. The moment you stop scrolling, stop reacting, stop reaching outward for validation, and turn inward, that moment, that still pause between thoughts, is rebellion. Because in a world designed to keep you distracted, to keep you fractured, to keep you dependent, stillness is subversion. Freixedo understood this. He didn't call for armies, he called for awakening. He knew that systems of control don't fear noise, they fear awareness. Not the kind taught in schools, but the kind that rises like a flame in the soul, the kind that sees clearly, without permission, without a filter, without fear. Because when you see, truly see, you can't be manipulated. You begin to notice the code in everything, the suggestions in your feed, the programming in your language, the guilt in your religion, the anxiety in your choices, and you realize none of it is you. You've been living a life written by someone else's script, but the moment you see that, you can step off the stage. That's the beginning of inner rebellion, not fighting the system, but exiting it, refusing to play your assigned role, refusing to feed what no longer serves you, refusing to bow to what was never divine. This is not passivity, this is power. Stillness that isn't empty, but full of clarity, full of truth, full of you. Freixedo believed that spiritual warfare isn't about angels and demons clashing in the sky. It's about consciousness being hijacked or reclaimed. And that reclamation happens moment by moment, in breath, in awareness, in choice. When you sit with yourself without numbing, when you observe your thoughts without judging, when you face your inner world without running, you are dismantling the greatest lie of all, that you are powerless, because a soul that knows itself cannot be owned. It cannot be farmed or bought or frightened into submission. It begins to glow, to move differently, to speak less, but mean more. And others feel it. The spell weakens, the grid flickers, and the system starts to shake. Not from force, but from frequency. That is the hidden truth. You were never just a subject. You were always the spark, the key, the portal, the one they feared might remember. And now, you are remembering, not just to awaken for yourself, but to become a mirror for others still asleep. Because true rebellion doesn't spread through violence, it spreads through presence, through one soul fully lit, standing quietly in the center of a collapsing illusion. You were never meant to stay asleep. You were never meant to serve, to obey without question, to kneel before systems that fear your awakening. From the moment you were born, there were hands trying to shape you, voices trying to claim you, patterns set in place before you could speak. But beneath it all, something remained untouched, unbroken, unowned. The part of you they could not program, the witness, the flame, the spark. That is what they tried to bury, with shame, with trauma, with dogma wrapped in gold. But a buried flame is not extinguished. It waits. And now, it stirs. Freixedo didn't write to scare you. He wrote to wake you. He exposed the invisible hierarchies. He named the energies behind the altars. He warned us of the rituals that looked like religion, but fed something far older, far darker. But he also reminded us of something they cannot touch: consciousness, the divine seed within, the force that watches thought without becoming it. That spark doesn't answer to Rome, or to presidents, or to screens. It answers to truth, to stillness, to your own knowing. And that's the spell, the one you were cast into from the beginning. The illusion that your power is outside you, that salvation must be earned, that you are unworthy without their permission. But the moment you see the spell is the moment you begin to break it, not through anger, but through remembrance, through choosing where your energy flows, through turning off the noise, through learning to listen again to the voice beneath the programming, the quiet one, the ancient one, the one that says, you are already whole, you are already divine, you are already free. This is why they fight so hard to keep you distracted, why fear is broadcast like oxygen, why stillness is almost extinct. Because if enough of us remember, everything they built collapses. Freixedo knew that. He saw what they hid. He paid the price for speaking it. And now, you know too. The question is not whether the system is real. It is. The question is whether you will keep feeding it with your belief, or whether you will step out, not to escape, but to create a new rhythm, a new attention, a new world. It doesn't begin in the streets. It begins inside. And from there, it spreads like fire, like memory, like light that was never truly gone. You were never meant to stay asleep. The time to remember is now. If something inside you stirred, if a veil was lifted, if a memory long buried began to rise, then this is only the beginning. You are not alone on this path. There are others waking up too, others who feel what cannot be explained, but knows when truth is spoken. So if this message reached you, share it. Let it ripple. Let it find the others still trapped in the dream. Subscribe now so you don't miss what's coming. Because we're not done, not even close. And in the comments, tell us what woke up inside you. Your voice may be the spark that lights someone else's fire. Together, we are unraveling the lie. Together, we are remembering. Welcome to the hidden voyage. Welcome home. Soul Whisper and Soul Creator. The hidden voyage. If this journey moves something in you, don't let it end in silence. Let it echo. Share it with someone still afraid to speak of death, still avoiding the mirror, still pretending time is infinite. Let this video be the hand you extend, the torch you pass, the doorway they didn't know they were seeking. Leave a comment, not just to speak, but to witness. What part of you is beginning to awaken? What have you been avoiding that now asks to be seen? And if your soul feels ready to keep walking, deeper, quieter, truer, then this is your place. Not just a channel, but a temple. Subscribe and join a circle of seekers who no longer run from the end because they've begun to live from it. We release these videos like offerings, each one a prayer, each one a mirror, each one a map to awaken before the end, to remember who you are beneath the name, to walk together toward what cannot die, one breath at a time, one truth at a time, one sacred step on the hidden voyage. Soul Whisper and Soul Creator. The Hidden Voyage.